Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for the introduction and for the invitation to speak today. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm going to talk to you today about the design of coercive institutions, such as military and police forces, in the aftermath of conflict. And this is a topic that I first started working on over a decade ago when I was a research assistant at the Council on Foreign Relations. This was maybe 2005 to 2007. And at the time, my focus there was on humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. And my time there coincided with the end of the second Sudanese civil war, which had pitted the government against a rebel group from the south, the Sudan People's Liberation Army. And this civil war had gone on for, at that point, 22 years. It was one of the longest civil wars on record. And it had just concluded with a peace agreement that people were sort of, I think, cautiously optimistic about at the time. But while that sort of conflict, that civil war was theoretically winding down, violence had started up in the western part of Sudan in Darfur. And part of my job at the time as a 25-year-old research assistant was to try and help my boss develop policy recommendations for the United Nations, for the United States, the African Union, for the Sudanese government, sort of as many interested parties as we could, to try and end the violence in Darfur, and more generally to try and create the conditions for a lasting peace throughout Sudan. Now, I can't tell you at this point what recommendations 25-year-old me came up with. I can tell you, they did not stop the violence that was happening in Sudan at the time. Even if they had all been implemented exactly as I had suggested, I probably would not have been able to do that. And there was a real sense, I think, it was not just me who felt a sense of frustration and maybe some futility, but I think many others in DC at the time were really frustrated and overwhelmed and thinking maybe that there was nothing that could have been done. The international community hadn't possibly learned from previous examples of mass atrocities and genocide, previous civil wars, and was not going to be able to do anything about the situation there. And so part of the reason I went to graduate school, which started that in 2007, was to see if I could get a better handle on how to prevent civil war, how to prevent mass atrocities. Now, as those of you who are currently in graduate school can probably attest, once you end up in a graduate program, sometimes you get pulled in different directions. Whatever you thought you were coming in to do, maybe you don't end up doing in the end. And that was the case with me. I ended up instead focusing on military coups d'etat, so seizures of power by the military, the dynamics of them, how to prevent them, and what causes some to succeed or some to fail. And it's only now, I think a decade later, that I've come back to the study of civil war and tried to integrate that sort of previous research interest with my work on coups. And I've come to realize, I think, that how states design their coercive institutions is an important part of the story in helping determine conditions for lasting peace. So I've learned a little bit about this since I was first working on it a decade ago, and I'm hoping today to try and share some of those lessons with you. So what I'm going to do in my talk today is argue that some of the reforms that are thought to reduce the likelihood that a civil war resumes can actually increase the risk of a military coup. I focus in particular on what's called rebel military integration, or military integration, which is where previously warring factions that had been excluded from the government are brought into it and brought into the military in particular. I'm going to, in this talk today, define military integration. I'm then going to explain how it's thought to prevent civil war from recurring. After that, I'm going to try and identify the two different ways that I think that it can lead to coups. And then I'm going to conclude with, hopefully, some more optimistic or proactive steps to recommend to mitigate some of those risks. So like how practically can we try and both ensure that civil war doesn't resume without increasing the risk of a coup. So I think that the concept of military integration is pretty straightforward. The basic idea is it's a situation in which former warring parties, typically the government and multiple rebel groups, or the populations that they represent, are included in a state's new national military. So previously warring parties are brought in. It's a very common phenomenon after civil wars. One study by Caroline Hartzell observed that between 1945 and 2006, some 40% of civil wars that ended with peace agreements, included provisions for integrating combatant forces. So it's pretty common. Now, of course, there's a great deal of variation in sort of how this is carried out. Sometimes it's just sort of a token rebel unit that's brought into the military. Sometimes it's kind of full integration into all the units. Sometimes the officer corps is integrated. Sometimes it's not. So there's some variation. But the basic idea is that these former combatants are brought into the new national military. And what rebel military integration is thought to do in the context of the aftermath of a civil war is to help the state solve a particular type of commitment problem. Now, civil wars are particularly hard to end, typically because there's a number of problems that the warring parties have in trying to make credible commitments not to fight anymore. One of them is that rebel leaders typically cannot speak for all of the members or all of the factions, all of the rebel groups that are challenging the government. So if the government does want to reach a peace agreement, it might have to negotiate with a bunch of different parties, and if it signs an agreement with one, that rebel leader cannot credibly commit to speak on behalf of all the other rebel leaders. So that's one kind of big commitment problem that prevents civil wars from ending. The other is a problem that the government has. The government often cannot credibly commit to uphold its side of the peace agreement because typically following a civil war, if there isn't some sort of integration, rebel military integration, the rebels have to lay down their arms. Like a precondition of the peace is typically that these non-state actors, rebel groups, are no longer armed. They demobilize, they hand in their weapons, and at that point, the government has no real incentive to try and follow whatever terms it's spelled out in the peace agreement, right? The government can go back on this agreement, and there's nothing rebels can do at that point because they've given up their weapons. They now would have to spend a lot more time raising funds, acquiring new weapons, reorganizing. This is very difficult for them to do. So the government can't credibly commit not to go back on its agreement with the rebels. And so these two dynamics, these two commitment problems are why civil wars tend to be much longer than we might hope. And military integration then is thought to try and mitigate or solve, ideally, but usually just slightly mitigate this second type of commitment problem. Because it gives rebels some foothold in the state's coercive apparatus. Right? It gives them some standing in the military or the presidential guard or the police forces or one of the sort of coercive institutions that make up the state's security sector. And that they can use that position, the idea is like kind of that there's a threat there, that they can use those weapons and access to the regime to pressure the government if it does not actually do what it said it was going to do in the agreement. So there's another benefit that comes from this, supposedly, which is that offering former combatants a role or a position in the military provides them with a pretty steady and comparatively lucrative form of employment. So it may be, particularly in longer civil wars, where combatants have been fighting their entire adult lives. Some of them were recruited as children. They haven't been to their homes for decades. It's very hard for them to then lay down their weapons and like go home or re-enter the workforce. And so this provides them with some sort of steady employment, some sort of prestige, some sort of funding. So it can help a conflict from resuming in that way. I should note here, however, that the evidence that this actually works to prevent civil wars from resuming is a bit mixed. There have been a number of studies that do find that the most durable peace agreements are those that include these kind of provisions, but there are other studies that find that that's not the case. Some studies find no effect at all. Some studies find that there's actually an increase in the risk of civil war resuming. And so I think the jury is out. And this might be because rebel military integration, as I said, kind of covers a bunch of different types of, like it can take a bunch of different forms. Sometimes officer corps is integrated, sometimes the units are integrated, sometimes they're not. And how extensive it is can really vary too. So it might just be that it's being implemented in different ways, and if you find the right way to do it, it would work. That's possible. But it's also possible that the places that choose to integrate the military are places where there are already other conditions that are supportive of peace, right? So the decision to integrate is might be because the warring parties really are done fighting, and they see this as a way forward for the country. But then there's no causal relationship between military integration and peace. There would have been peace sort of no matter what they did with the military. So that's sort of one possibility that a couple scholars, Krebs and Licklater in particular, two people have been working on this for a little bit, suggest might be really accounting for the positive relationship that some of the studies have been finding between the duration of peace and rebel military integration. So I think the jury's out on that right now, and it's a topic or a question that I can't answer for you today, but one in which I'm gonna sort of bracket. presuming that it does have the beneficial effects that many of its proponents think that it has, I want to, in my talk today, sort of point out this unanticipated negative side effect that is unrelated to the Civil War resuming, but I think that is also important. And that's that military integration, I argue, is likely to result in more coup attempts. Now, at first glance, you might say, well, why do we care about coups, right? Like, compared to civil wars, they result in many fewer fatalities. Sometimes they're just kind of these intra-elite struggles that don't really change anything. Often they're just replacing one authoritarian regime with another authoritarian regime. You might think that in the grand scheme of things, these are less important things to pay attention to. But I would argue that this risk is actually important. And it's worth taking seriously in part because leaders themselves take it so seriously. A lot of the decisions that leaders make about how to structure their security forces, how to staff and resource their military, decisions that have important implications for civil war and for military international conflict and for repression. All these decisions are in part tied to the fear that rulers have about coups. For them, military coups are much more immediate of a threat than a civil war is. After a coup, military leaders are deposed, they may be killed, they're often killed in the fighting, whereas if you lose a civil war, you can usually negotiate your way sort of out of it. So they see it as a really important risk, and they take a bunch of steps to try and prevent it. Successful coups often usher in authoritarian regimes or step back post-conflict reforms, and even failed coups can result in a significant amount of bloodshed. In the paper on Will There Be Blood, I demonstrate that half of coup attempts result in some bloodshed, and some of them become incredibly violent, having violence on par with civil war, so hundreds of even thousands of fatalities. So I think they're worth paying attention to. So what do we know at this point about military coups, civil wars, and peace agreements? What is the relationship? What I'm going to do is highlight some research that's been ongoing by a scholar at the University of Maryland, Peter White, who's demonstrated some sort of empirical relationships with using cross-national data. And then I'm going to talk about his arguments and my arguments, which are separate, about what might explain those patterns. And I'm going to talk through two cases that I think illustrate them. So I'll talk about cases of coups in Burundi and Guinea-Bissau. Okay, so research by Peter White, is currently under review, finds that, using quantitative data, finds that states that have recently signed a peace agreement are more likely to see coup attempts than states that do not, or the states that have not signed a peace agreement. And this is particularly true where peace agreements contain provisions to integrate military forces. So there's a number of coup attempts that he discusses in his work. And I think that the takeaway from sort of looking through those cases is that this is very much a story centered in Sub-Saharan Africa. So a lot of the coups that are happening in that region. There's a coup in Guinea-Bissau in 1999, in Mali in 1991, in Niger in 1996, Chad 1993 and 2006, Burundi 2001, the Congo 2004. This list can go on, but there's one in Cambodia that also fits this pattern. But it's largely really a story about Africa. So what explains it? Like, why is it the case that the countries that have recently signed peace agreements are more likely to see coup attempts? There's two potential answers. One is the one that White focuses on, and one is my own intuition work. So the one that White develops focuses on grievances within the regular military. So the idea is if you're bringing rebel forces into the military, some of the soldiers in the regular military might have to be demobilized, unless you just want a giant sprawling military. Even if they're not being demobilized, if you're going to create a giant sprawling military that combines the previous military and the rebel forces, it can create a lot of friction and cognitive dissonance or frustration among soldiers who do not want to be working with and working alongside people that they were formerly trying to kill, people they're formerly trying to stop from winning this war. Unless the military size is expanded, military integration requires demobilization. These soldiers often don't have another good sort of option for sort of steady, lucrative work. And the availability of promotions may also be curtailed, right? This generates a lot of frustration among the military, the previously existing military forces, and they might stage a coup to try and prevent integration from going forward or stop it once it's in progress. So that's one important source of coup attempts in the wake of peace agreements. A second possibility is that military integration enables rebels to stage coups they previously could not have staged, right? So it's the rebels that are being brought into the national security forces, into the military, into the police, or to other security organizations, now have arms and access to the regime in a way that they did not. And I think it's important here to take a step back and think about why the rebels and the populations they represent weren't already part of the security forces. Like, why is it these people were kept out? And I think that particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's been important work by Phil Rossler and a few others that have focused on this, basically how pressing the threat of a coup is, and how leaders have often used ethnicity as a shortcut to try and identify who is likely to be disloyal to them. So one common strategy to try and prevent coups in ethnically divided states has been to exclude people who are not co-ethnics from the military and from the security forces, right? This is to limit the threat of the coup. The downside, however, is that you now have former soldiers and former officers with military know-how able to regroup and challenge the government through rebellion. So indeed, some of these civil wars that we're talking about were a result of efforts to prevent a coup by kicking out particular populations or groups of people from the military. When you let those people back into the military, that then enables them to stage the coup that they might have staged in the first place. So if successful military integration, diversifies the armed forces and give people that did not previously have access to the regime access to it. Even peace agreements without rebels military intervention, I want to note, can also have this effect if they don't require rebels to fully disarm, if the disarmament is sort of partial, or if they allow them unmolested access to centers of power, right? So even if they are not part of the official security forces, some of them may retain weapons, and if they're just in the capital and they're not being driven out of it actively, they then have that kind of ground from which to stage a coup. So as a result, peace agreements, particularly those with military intervention provisions, can raise the risk of a coup from former rebels in addition to coups from within the existing military. So I'm going to briefly mention two examples of coup attempts I think follow these patterns decently well. And then I'll wrap up by talking about some different potential strategies or policy implications to try and reduce the risk of these coups. So the first case I want to mention is of Burundi in 2001. Right? And this is an example of a situation in which attempts at military integration fostered grievances that led to a coup from within the existing military. Actually, two coup attempts in Burundi in 2001. So they occurred after signing peace accords to end Burundi's civil war, which had begun in 1993. And to give you some context on the case of Burundi, it's a small, poor, landlocked country, about 8 million people. There's two major ethnic groups in Burundi, Hutu, which are about 85% of the population, and Tutsi, which are about 14% of the population. And although Tutsis are in the minority in Burundi, they've effectively ruled the country for all but 4 months since the country's independence in 1962. The military, since independence, had also been dominated by Tutsis. And the civil war began in Burundi in 1993 because Tutsi soldiers assassinated Burundi's first democratically elected president, who was a Hutu, and a 1993 coup. In response, Hutu rebels took up arms. In the resulting civil war, an estimated 200,000 people were killed. And in this civil war, the army was described as sort of a major target, right? There was a ton of frustration about the army not being integrated, the army not allowing sufficient numbers of Hutu soldiers and officers to be a part of it. So it was described as basically revising the demographics of the military was a major aim of the rebels. In 2000, peace accords were signed by the government, and several rebel groups had fractured at this point. They provided for a rotating presidency, multi-party elections, and the integration of the military to bring it to a 50-50 Hutu-Tutsi split. And this is despite the fact that I would say that that's not what the exact demographics of the country are. But the idea was you needed to have this split. This was explicitly done, the peace agreement stated, in view of the need to achieve ethnic balance and prevent acts of genocide and coups, right? So the idea at the time was let's have this military be 50-50. This is going to prevent future coup attempts like the one that started the civil war. And the military initially let integration go forward, bringing Hutus in their rank and file, but they tried to block integration into the officer corps. So that's when they drew the line. And there was a series of coup attempts in 2001 that basically tried to depose the president in order to prevent that integration from going forward. I think it was sheer luck in many ways that those coup attempts failed, integration proceeded. But I will note that the main Hutu rebel group had not signed that agreement, and the conflict continued after that point. There's a sort of final settlement concluded in 2006. And so those two coups did not end up sort of preventing military integration from happening, but they also that peace agreement was not the end of the conflict. Okay, so that's the example of one situation, one coup, or a set of coups that was driven by frustration or grievances within the military, this desire not to have to share their posts or be supervised by these former rebels. The second example I'm going to talk about is more an example of a peace agreement allowing rebels more access to the regime and then using that access to then stage a coup. So this is the coup in Guinea-Bissau in 1999. The civil war in Guinea-Bissau was very different. It was a much shorter civil war. It began in 1998 and only lasted until 1999. And the conflict, though, was just the latest iteration of sort of ongoing intra-elite conflicts that had been present in Guinea-Bissau since it gained independence from Portugal in 1974. Now, Guinea-Bissau is much more ethnically diverse than Burundi. The largest ethnic group, the Fulani, is only 29%. Balanta is next at 22%. And there's a number of other ethnic groups with much smaller sort of numbers. And the leadership of Guinea-Bissau has not been from one of the major ethnic groups. They've come from smaller groups. But they face the problem. Both sort of two major post-independence rulers of Guinea-Bissau face the same problem, is that the military that they inherited at independence was Balanta dominated. So these early rulers who came from smaller ethnic groups tried to restructure the military to reduce Balanta dominance and exclude Balanta from top government posts. And a result, as you might imagine, is the military, existing soldiers in the military were not pleased about this, and there was a whole series of coup attempts, most of which failed, but which eventually deposed both the first and the second ruler of Guinea-Bissau. The second administration lasted until 1998, when the president tried to help himself stay in power by purging political opponents, building up counterweights to the military, such as a strong presidential guard, restricting the military's budget, and getting rid of the army chief of staff, which he had increasingly come into conflict with. So he fires the army chief of staff and tries to replace him with someone new. But troops loyal to the chief of staff seized control of army barracks in the capital. And they rebelled. So the civil war actually started with this fracture within the military. The result was an 11-month-long civil war in and around the capital that ended up displacing about 350,000 people out of a population of 1.2 million. The war, as I said, did not last particularly long. It was over 11 months. The peace agreement was signed in November 1998, which formed a unity government. Importantly, it did not actually include explicit provisions for rebel military integration, but it did include provisions for power sharing that brought Balanta back into positions of power, allocated power from military ministries to them, including the Ministry of Defense and Internal Administration, so kind of the Ministry of Interior. So those positions were given to former rebels. As part of the disagreement, part of the agreement, the president was also supposed to disband his presidential guard, which had been kind of repressive elite force that he had used to try and stave off coups, but had been dragging his feet. And it was frustration with his refusal to do so sort of reform the military in this way, that caused rebel troops that were still present, that were present in the capital, to try and seize power in a coup in 1999. So they had technically relinquished their weapons, actually. They had given them up, but they knew where they were stored. They were stored at the airport, and they were able to relatively easily take them back. So they weren't completely disarmed. And they were able to overpower the sort of existing defense of the storage units at the international airport. And they successfully ousted the president from power in 1999. So in this case, even without an explicit provision for the rebels to be integrated into the military, and even after they had handed over their weapons, they were able to use their access and knowledge of the capital to be able, and their ability to be present there without being pushed out, to seize these weapons back and use it to stage the coup. So the very people that the president had attempted to exclude from positions within the military and government for fear of a coup, thereby provoking the civil war, were able to take advantage of the access the peace agreement afforded them to stage one after the war ended. Okay. So these are the two ways in which I think coups can happen following peace agreements, particularly those with rebel military integration. I've argued that peace agreements, particularly those with these provisions for integration, can generate grievances within existing soldiers, leading them to stage a coup. And I've argued they can also provide former rebels with access to the executive and coup targets in a way that increases their ability to stage a coup. I want to conclude by talking about some things that might be done to mitigate these risks. I think first, most generally, I would agree with a sort of growing group of scholars that is a little pessimistic or skeptical about the prospects for rebel military integration sort of being a solution to all of our problems in the aftermath of conflict, and suggesting that outside actors who are involved in peace processes not foisted upon local actors if there isn't demand from below. So more generally, I think there's some reasons to be more cautious about rebel military integration. But if it does go forward, I think there's a couple concrete steps that can be taken to try and reduce the risk of a coup. None of these are perfect, so all of them come with downsides, which I'll mention, but there's some ways in which I think this risk could be lessened. So if you want to prevent coups from within the existing ranks of the military, right, if you want to prevent these new grievances from forming that might result in a coup, you can focus on alleviating these grievances by allowing the military to expand in size. However, that's not necessarily desirable for other reasons, but if the military wasn't that big to begin with, that might be an option. Or you could provide attractive or lucrative employment opportunities outside of that to demobilize soldiers. This is not a cost-free solution either, in that it requires a lot of outside resources, and there's some evidence that trying to retrain soldiers to do other jobs doesn't necessarily work in the ways which we'd like it to, but trying to figure out basically paying attention to the risk that these demobilized soldiers in the regular military are going to be, that their fear about what they're going to do afterwards might be driving them, suggests that real careful attention could be paid to helping those soldiers transition to some other forms of employment. And if there is outside intervention in a conflict or outside aid that's there, could be focused on trying to help those soldiers basically transition to a different position. To prevent coups from the former rebels after integration goes forward, I think one of the best strategies is to try and integrate horizontally at the unit level, breaking up former rebels among a bunch of different units rather than allowing them to kind of retain their old formations. This makes it much harder for them to collude. This is obviously a very common strategy that's been used to try and prevent collusion. Most leaders use this in some way, trying to divide their militaries into different services and foment rivalries between the branches and create a bunch of different sort of coup-proofing units and things like this to counterbalance one another. But I think you can do this in a way that doesn't necessarily require politicizing the forces, but focusing on sort of making sure that the way in which you're comprising your units is not you're not doing it on an ethnic basis. So basically saying like having a requirement, for example, in one of the cases we talked about, there was a requirement for the 50-50 split. You could have that as an entrance requirement, but then not actually designate units on that basis and basically allow people to be sorted to positions without regard for ethnicity. And that would help, I think, break up, kind of distribute people across multiple units and make it harder for them to coordinate on a coup. The last, I think, suggestion that I have here to prevent both types of coups, both from aggrieved military officers and from former rebels, is to focus on strengthening non-politicized counterweights to the military. So as I've talked to several of you about already, most of my work is on coup prevention and how to prevent military coups from happening. And I focus in particular on the strategy of counterbalancing the military with other forces. This has some downsides, and it can result in more violent coups. It doesn't necessarily deter coup attempts, but it makes them harder to carry out. And I think that I've dug into a couple of cases. I've seen examples of situations where you can use more professional police or well-equipped police or other depoliticized forces in the Ministry of Interior to try and balance the military without making them the sort of personal force of a leader or really fostering a bunch of antagonisms between them. So you can try and do it in a more depoliticized way by just making sure the Ministry of Interior has a decently well-equipped police that could impede a coup that's in process. My other research shows that this is successful even in democracies. There's also this sort of more broad form of counterbalancing that can happen by fostering civic institutions, political parties, sort of institutions that are not coercive institutions, but that are civic institutions that can form, would be the basis of opposition to any coup that might be staged. This is a much more long-term prospect. It's not very easy to do this. It's what everyone's trying to do in post-conflict settings. But understanding that this can also help with the risk of a coup, and we should be paying attention to the risk of a coup in these settings, I think might help focus our attention on making sure that resources are allocated to try and get that as right as possible. So there are downsides to all of these steps. They're not guaranteed to prevent coups. And I think that thinking about which of them you might want to try in a post-conflict setting requires assessing what type of coup threat is bigger, if it's from the military, existing military, or for rebels. And how you're going to weigh that against whatever potential benefits you think that you might get from rebel military integration. So there aren't easy choices in these situations, but hopefully today I've outlined for you some of the things we should be thinking about, some of the potential risks of going forward with military integration, and even peace agreements without military integration, but that allow rebels in the capital. And I think that having these these dynamics in mind can hopefully help us design better peace agreements that are less likely to foster coups. So with that, I will conclude my comments, and I look forward to questions and points from the audience. Thanks.
What exactly do you envision as the role of the international community in this process? Like, how involved should they be, or should this really be kind of a homegrown project?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's an increasing push, I think, among some scholars and practitioners to tell the international community to sort of back off in these situations, and to say that to only support, for example, military integration when it's being demanded from below. I think in part because there are these risks that come along with it, both potentially, both that we're not 100% sure that it prevents conflict from resuming and that it might prevent coups. I think that that is evidence in favor of the people who would say there should be a little bit more limited involvement of international actors. But I think that a lot of the suggestions or tentative proposals that I've outlined to try and prevent coups, if you're going to go forward with military integration, really require outside actors. So they require often training from soldiers and police in other countries, particularly if you're going to try and build up and professionalize a police force. They require resources to try and address employment opportunities for demobilized soldiers. So like a lot of money, a lot of know-how. Those things can be hard to generate domestically. And so I guess I would suggest I'd be cautious about international actors coming in and trying to say this is how you need to do rebel military integration, and we're going to tell you how to do it. But if there is that demand to do it, I think that there's these positive roles that international actors could play.
Institutionalization of the coercive apparatuses, either before or during the Civil War, and how that may have an impact.
Sure. Can you explain what you mean by institutionalization?
So more formalized coercive apparatuses instead of like more of a patronage system.
I see. So when I think about formalized institutions, I think both about like how professional they are, and then I think also about like how regulated they are. And the more professional your armed forces are, like the more sort of norms they have of like civilian control, more sense that they have of like this is a vocation, this is the sort of big civil military literature is all about fostering these kinds of norms of professionalism. Then I think the easier the set, for the risk of a coup is lower. And so if you're thinking about countries with more formalized institutions that have had professional militaries that have been very competent internationally, in the conflicts that they've had to be a part of, that sort of see themselves having this particular role that's not very politically involved, then this is a lot easier. And then you could expect rebel military integration to probably go forward in a way that doesn't create the risk of coups in the same way. If you're thinking about institutionalization in terms of like regulation, one thing that comes to mind for me is that a lot of countries have they have coercive apparatuses that include a bunch of state security forces, but then they also have armed groups that are only partially recognized, maybe they fund, but that are not really a formal part of the security sector. And I think having those groups around, particularly in the capital, where you have where the targets of the coup attempts are typically located, creates another set of like actors that you have to address and deal with. And so, a lot of times, if these are just sort of part-time militia that the government is paying, but they're not really like an active fighting force, then you wouldn't, and most of those groups like that are kept out of the capital because they're primarily used in areas in which the government doesn't have a ton of capacity. And so in that case, I think they're not much of a, they don't have the potential to be a spoiler for this process, the peace process, or for in terms of staging a coup in the same way. It's only when these forces are operating, these kind of like, militias and things are operating in major urban centers and in the capital that they can really be a spoiler. And so where those forces are located, and there's more informal forces that are tied to the government loosely, are operating in the capital, I think they have to be taken seriously as part of the peace process too, and peace agreements should be bringing those forces in. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Hi, so thank you for your talk. What do you think, so in terms of integrating vertically or horizontal, how is that affected by the type of conflict that the Civil War was? So an ethnically based one versus one that was originally seeking to overthrow the government.
Right. So I think a vertical integration where you're integrating the officer corps also is much harder in ethnically motivated conflicts. At least that's my perception thus far. And that's typically where you see the most resistance from the military, right? They often are like, okay, these excluded groups can be a part of the rank and file. We don't mind commanding them. We don't mind sending them to the front line. We don't mind sort of giving them the jobs we don't want to do, but you don't want to have to take orders from them. And so that can be, the vertical integration can be, I think, the sticking point for a lot of people. Conflicts that are not ethnically based might also have similar dynamics if there's really deep ideological divisions. People that were part of a former repressive apparatus versus people that were fighting against it, they might also have some of those like similar problems. But the cases that we've seen of coup attempts happening following peace agreements have largely not been ideologically motivated conflicts. They have largely been these ethnic conflicts. And so I think it's mainly been, for whatever reason, the integration that is happening in those conflicts does not seem to be producing the same sort of coups. And I think that I need to know more about those type of civil wars to be able to have a real defense of why that is the case, but that those type of conflicts don't seem to be driving these dynamics. Yeah?
I'm curious about your second suggestion on how to address this. You said that divided groups across different regiments and prevent collusion.
Yeah.
Your earlier work talks about how counterbalancing doesn't necessarily prevent communication and collusion. So how do those two line up?
Excellent point, which demonstrates impressive familiarity with my earlier work. So the article you're mentioning is about how counterbalancing works. And I show that we tend to think of it as creating all these coordination problems, and that you can't successfully stage a coup if you've got a bunch of different units, because it's very hard. You're training in isolation, you have different chains of command, you're stationed in different places to try and actually contact everyone, infiltrate, like for the coup plotters to infiltrate everybody that needs to be infiltrated. My research shows that, a couple things. First is that counterbalancing does not seem to deter coup attempts, but it does seem to be associated with less successful coup outcomes. And I show that within those coups that are staged, the way in which counterbalancing works is not by creating coordination problems where like you can't actually capture targets because you couldn't communicate well enough with other potential plotters, but by generating real incentives for soldiers that are in these sort of counterbalancing units to try and defend the regime. Like they feel connection to the regime even if it's not on an ethnic basis, or even if they're not being paid more or something like that. They know that in most cases when the military takes power, it starts centralizing control, disbanding other units. Their prestige is going to go down. They no longer have employment. And so there's real incentives for them to actually defend the regime. So I show that while coups are in progress, we don't see problems of coordination. Where I think the coordination story does happen, at least we don't see much evidence. There's a couple cases where it possibly played a role. But I think there is evidence of coordination and inclusion problems happening in the decision to start or to launch a coup in the first place. And so my focus in the talk today has been about coup attempts, whether or not they're successful. So as I mentioned, several of the coups did not succeed. The coup in Guinea-Bissau did succeed, but the coups in Burundi did not. And I think that they're still, where the coordination story really matters is in the decision to stage the coup in the first place, right? And so what you probably will have is less that, like, even if on average counterbalancing does not produce fewer coup attempts, there is some subset of coups that is being prevented by this, and there's some other subset of coups that's happening that maybe wouldn't have happened because you have new grievances. So in the end, they might balance out, but for any individual country, it make more sense to try and employ this to deter coup attempts. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah?
Since we talked about creating, we were talking back there also about creating these paramilitary organization as a counter to regular security force. Now, when the integration takes place and you are bringing in rebels, now what do you suggest should be the ethnic composition of that counter paramilitary force? Because again, there are slightly contradictory trade-offs here. Because let's say if I make them rebel also, that might prevent one kind of grievance but lead to another kind of grievance.
Yes, this is a good question, and I think as where I need to go next with the research. I was talking to you and a couple other people before this talk about the work on ethnic stacking as a coup prevention strategy is slightly separate from the work on counterbalancing, and that what me and the people who are working on these two areas want to do is bring all of our data together and try and think about how rulers might use these in conjunction with each other when they would choose one versus another, and what specifically those trade-offs are. So my sense is that focusing only on how you're organizing these coercive institutions in terms of who's in control of them, what the command and control structures are, counterbalancing can be effective even without this sort of ethnic component. Like, you don't have to have these forces tied to the regime through some sort of ethnic ties, regional ties. They don't have to be from your hometown. They don't have to pass some ideological test. Just the mere fact of breaking them up, no matter what their composition is, should reduce the likelihood that a coup that is staged succeeds. And so my feeling from the work that I have done previously is that you don't have to exclude these rebel forces from the counterweights in order to get the coup prevention benefit of counterbalancing. I think that as we get better and better data on ethnic exclusion and demographics in the military, we can test some of these things a lot more precisely. And so that's why I'm looking forward to a couple of projects going on right now to code ethnicity in the military. They're right now focused on isolated regions, but as those things are ramping up, then I think we can see if that pans out. That's my intuition so far. Yeah?
So Sheena Greatness's recent work talks about how basically there's an inherent trade-off here between trying to protect against coups and trying to protect against these mass uprisings. So if we're talking about the peace agreement, a negotiated settlement, and then you're trying to design your coercive institutions there, is there a way that you can possibly balance both of these things? Because clearly we have very recent history that suggests you must be worried about the masses. Can you simultaneously try to address the risk of that mass uprising while also protecting against coups?
I think this is a fundamental problem or difficulty in governance in most of the world, is that those things are a trade-off. And I think that absent more sort of long-term changes in civil-military relations, it's very hard to do things precisely to eliminate one or the other of those, or both of those threats at the same time. And so I think that with any individual country, their leaders might choose to go a different direction. And whatever threat that they think is more pressing is going to be the one that they typically emphasize. I think more often than not, rulers see the threat of a coup as more important than the threat of a mass uprising and more important than the threat of a rebellion. And so they're frequently making these coup-proofing choices, these decisions to counterbalance, decisions to ethnically stack, that then end up fostering civil war and mass uprisings. And so I think historically we've seen leaders make that choice. And it really requires, I think, leadership in a country that is very committed to democratic institutions and very committed to putting the country on a path towards civilian, permanent civilian governance, and not worried so much about their own individual fates. That's very hard. I mean, I guess it's a kind of cop-out to say that individual leaders matter. It's not a thing that political scientists often find very, very satisfying, because it's very hard to quantify or measure or tell a country you just need good leaders. But this is the sort of quality of individual leadership is something that I've been coming back to more and more as I think about this and how it can set countries on sort of different paths. And so I'd mentioned in our talk earlier that my advisor's work has been on India and Pakistan, and civil military relations there, and trying to understand, this is my dissertation advisor, Steve Wilkinson, he's trying to understand basically why India became a democracy and Pakistan did not. And partly he talks about counterbalancing and the way that India was able to do that in a way that was not particularly politicized, in a way that, as a democracy, was able to kind of fragment their security forces and deter coup attempts. But part of the story is just he claims better leaders, and I think that that's not something that can be replicated. And there is potentially a role for international actors to try and provide assurances to individual leaders. If there is a coup, we will support you, or if there is a, we will condemn it with a lot of force. But this is a dynamic that is, I think, so central to it's a sort of fundamental one for rulers across most of the globe, and so it's not something that I think we can solve. We can only try and look at individual circumstances. What are the biggest threats? What's going to be more destabilizing? How can we structure our institutions to try and prevent that from happening? In many cases, it might not be coups. In many cases, we might be much more concerned about the civil war, in which case then you can disregard the things that I've said.
Yeah, I'm curious if in your research you've seen efforts on the part of some states to fundamentally shake up the model of how security services are organized. Right? So there's this historical expectation of the military for external defense and police and other security forces for maintaining order at home. The story you were telling, a lot of it had to do with Sub-Saharan Africa, in which for the most case there don't tend to be interstate wars, right? Yeah. So why is that model even appropriate? And are there efforts on the part of rulers, scholars, international organizations to think about fundamentally changing the way the security services are organized so that it doesn't replicate that sort of standard model? I mean, there aren't very many countries around the world that said, "Oh, we don't need a military." Like Costa Rica, and I think there might be one other one. I forget.
Mauritius or something. I think. Yeah, it's very Madagascar. I would say. It's really rare, and I think that part of the answer is that really in Sub-Saharan Africa, where there isn't much of a threat of external warfare, international conflict, the state is a large provider of jobs. And they're seen, the positions of the military are seen as lucrative, prestigious in some cases, sometimes not, but often this is a place of, it's a very important source of employment. And so you can get very large militaries in these places, even if there is no sort of external threat, purely for patronage reasons or purely for sort of as a public service sort of job provision sort of thing. And then these armies do end up getting used to fight insurgencies and to sometimes fight across borders to help other insurgencies challenge their neighbors. And so most of the militaries aren't sitting around doing nothing. They're primarily focused on these internal tasks. I have not seen examples in Sub-Saharan Africa where rulers are really reconsidering this. In many cases, their militaries and internal security forces were set up by former colonizing powers, and they just inherited these structures. A lot of the former French colonies, in particular, inherited very strong gendarmerie forces or internal security forces, and most of those countries have kept those. So they have a strong internal security force, then they might have local police in addition, and then they have a strong military, and so they've kind of set up to be counterbalanced from the beginning. And then there's been a learning process by which some people see other rulers doing this and kind of see this proliferation of security forces, particularly in the 1970s is when I find it happening the most. And the only thing that really cuts against that is when the military itself is in charge. Frequently, military regimes are the ones disbanding all these other potential security forces. Like, they're undertaking reforms. Military regimes don't last very long, and most of them have devolved into personal or personalist rule within Sub-Saharan Africa. And in those cases, then the leaders are right back to creating independent security forces and sort of proliferating things. But because the military, I think, at independence is structured in a particular way, a lot of the states have just continued. Like, there's been a lot of path dependence in that.
One of the things that's missing in this discussion about what the leader wants is what the people think.
Yeah. I don't think they came in, I mentioned that once.
And I ask that partly because in some of the cases where outsiders have gone in to try and help states think about what to do with their security forces, there's this sort of demobilize everybody, vet people so people who committed atrocities don't end up back in the force.
Right.
Where does that fit in the picture you're painting?
That's a good question, and it's not. I think that I definitely frame this in terms of like incentives by soldiers, incentives by rulers of these countries. I think where you see citizens more engaged in this process is there's a lot of pressure, not necessarily for revolutionary integration, but for more broadly the idea of security sector reform. they tend to see government forces as, in many places, as very repressive, and so what they want is the people who are responsible for that repression to face some sort of consequence. They sometimes are charging, there's sort of a push to get them excluded from the military. And so they tend to be pushing for much more broader sweeping changes, and at least in the cases that I've seen, not been as involved with questions about, like, are you counterbalancing the military? It's like they only care about that, or they only care about military integration if it's resulting in higher levels of repression. So if someone's presidential guard is seen as a particularly repressive force, they want that disbanded. And that was partially the case in the coup in Guinea-Bissau, in that the presidential guard was seen as a particularly brutal and kind of repressive security force. And so the rebels staged this coup to disband it, but I think they were riding a wave of sort of popular sentiment related to that. They were not, it was not just independence. They said they on their own, I mean, they were upset about it, but it was because that was a very popular position. And so that coup ended up succeeding, in part, I think, because there was some support for that. There was a sense that the president was not upholding his bargain. And so, you know, the process by which then people get people from that are part of the security sector during very repressive periods in terms of counterinsurgencies in particular are like held accountable for things that they might have done. This is typically like, you know, doesn't happen often, it's very slow. I mean, and so it's often the case that I think that people's frustration can build to a point where they're pushing for, like they're coalescing around the peace agreement, around security sector reform being included, but then it's kind of the slow process by which it doesn't happen. And so it's often, I think leaders can think that they can discount it because they're like, they're not gonna be ever, like, civilians are not going to be ever as organized as they are at the end of a civil war. Like the rebel groups are not going to be as organized as they are at the end of the civil war, and so they can discount it and sort of kick it down the road. And so I think, unfortunately, a situation where the interests of most civilians are not being taken into account, but they might have a role to play in terms of trying to prevent coup attempts from happening. So particularly since the end of the Cold War, there's been a lot more sort of public opinion or public pressure, like not to stage coups, to try and work out civil military grievances in other ways. There's pressure to have elections right after them, and so that's like the initial reactions of civilians might increasingly be important to the outcome of those coups or sort of what happens after the coups. But I think for the most part they haven't prevented those coups from happening. So I think you're right to point this out as a big missing component, and it might be that there's a bigger role civilians can play in trying to help rebel military integration go forward, or trying to keep a peace agreement together that is thus far not part of the story that I've told, but that should be there.
Fact too, though.
Yeah, that's fair.
Anyway, we are pretty much at the end of our time, unless there's one, I don't know if there's one last question or if we should wrap up. But I want to thank you very much for coming, because this was really interesting and rich. And we have a small gift and also some Halloween.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.